For many, Occupy movements that began in New York and have spread throughout the United States have been difficult to understand. Where's their leadership structure? Why not make a list of demands? Why all this anarchist nonsense, consensus and with the sparkly fingers? You're never going to reach regular Americans like this. The argument goes that Occupy must come up with demands. They must impose discipline on their movement. They must do certain things to be taken seriously. By taking a recognizable and familiar form, some hope to channel its energy into partisan politics. Of course, this would also mean the end of Occupy. Demands could be met, armies recalled, and we can all get back to normal. This is to profoundly misunderstand Occupy. If Occupy has anarchist roots, then the fundamental demand is to never go back to normal. Occupy is more than a movement against Wall Street. As Matt Taibbi, writer for the Rolling Stone, explained, Occupy is ultimately about, quote, providing a forum for people to show how tired they are, not just of Wall Street, but everything. A place to escape the, quote, life-killing chase for money, money, and more money, where the only thing that changes from minute to minute is that every tick of the clock brings with it another space-age vendor dreaming up some new way to try to sell you something or reach into your pocket. Occupy is a visceral, impassioned, deep-seated rejection of the entire direction of our society, a refusal to take even one more step forward into the shallow commercial abyss of phoniness, short-term calculation, withered idealism, and intellectual bankruptcy that American mass society has become. If there is such a thing as going on strike for one's own culture, this is it. And it is precisely for being so broad in scope and elemental in its motivation that it has flown over the heads of many on the left and the right. On December 2011, the magazine Title, dedicated to Occupy theory, published a message entitled Communique Number 1. Operating in the realm of narrative and story, it labeled the stories told since our birth as, quote, a world of ghosts and illusions that have haunted our minds our entire lives. And contrasted those stories with the hope for a new one, a new narrative, a new creative vision for humanity. Occupy as a place for, quote, refugees from a dreamland seeking asylum in the actual, a place where for once no one is trying to bleed you or sell you something, a place where people are free to dream of some other way for human beings to get along, beyond auction democracy, tyrannical commerce, and the bottom line. The communique states, this is what we seek to occupy, to rediscover and reclaim the world. Many believe we have come to Wall Street to transact some kind of business with its denizens, to strike a deal. We haven't come to negotiate. We have come to confront the darkness at its source. Here, where the big apple sucks in more of the sap from the national tree than it needs or deserves, as if spliced from some Edenic forebear, serpent-sized worms feast within and gorged on swollen fruit. Here the world is chewed and digested into bits as tiny and fluid as the electrons that traders use to bring nations and homeowners to their knees. We see that the basic quantum of experience has become the transaction, that life's central purpose is to convert all existence into tradable currency. We have come here to doubt and dispute that. When we peek at the blueprints made for the project, we see drawn there a fantastic land of gaudy castles surrounded by a protective fence of broken glass, and outside this territory, a vast denuded plain scribbled with the words rabble, suckers, consumers, them. What do we want from Wall Street? Nothing, because it has nothing to offer. We have come here to assert our real selves and lives, to build genuine relationships with each other in the world, and to remind ourselves another path is possible. If the phantoms of Wall Street are confused by our presence in their dreams, so much the better. It is time that the unreal be exposed for what it is. Even on the rare occasion when neoliberals admit our system may not be the best, we assure no other system is possible. As the Iron Lady assured us, there is no alternative. Occupy finds itself located in the counter-belief that there are thousands of alternatives. Occupiers have broken the frame of narrative, a non-negotiable rejection of the official narrative on our economic and politics, a rejection of the conditioned response to that narrative acting on their own authority. Occupy is an experiment. What will the future look like? How will we get there? This is what Occupy hopes to discover following the anarchist belief that liberty and experiment alone can determine the best forms of society. This is the imaginative power of the Occupy movement. As Tolkien reminded us, a story told right and in harmony with a higher truth can be filled with grace and made real. Occupy may not be a real model yet, but like Tolkien, I believe a single dream is more powerful than 1,000 realities. Another world isn't just possible, other worlds have happened. We may discover there has been almost nothing but other worlds. Unlike Lehi and his family, we don't have a promised land to flee to. There's no undiscovered country, so with nowhere to go, we must hollow out a new way of living in the here and now and give up the superficial and foolish notion that we can correct what is wrong by merely tinkering with the institutional machinery. The changes that are required are fundamental changes in the way we're living. Like Samuel occupying the walls of Zarahemla against Nephites who had lost their way, Occupy represents a voice that we should be wary not to ignore. I believe that Mormon scripture is both complementary with Occupy critiques and also prophetic in showing us a way forward that many have begun to articulate. Both the Occupy movements and the Book of Mormon agree, in large part, as to what ails us. The Book of Mormon speaks of despising and grinding the face of the poor, robbing and oppressing the poor by withholding food from the hungry, clothing from the naked, and a culture obsessed with vanities, costly apparel, and mammon, which inevitably results in class distinctions and great inequality. Mormon prophesies that not only will inequality reign, but even the Holy Church of God will love money, substance, fine apparel, and the adorning of its churches more than the poor and needy, the sick and afflicted, all for the praise and vanity of the world. Is this diagnosis much different than Occupy complaints that the 1% have accumulated most of the wealth, withholding from the 99%? This stems from what Nibley calls Samuel's Law, that when the economy becomes the main or engrossing concerns of a society, or in the routine Book of Mormon phrase, when they begin to set their hearts upon the riches, the economy will self-destruct, leading to all manners of inequities. It is what the LDS First Presidency proclaimed once upon a time in 1875, one of the great evils which our own nation has menaced, wonderful growth of wealth in the hands of comparatively few individuals. Both the Book of Mormon and Occupy map out the rise of corporations or combinations that ingratiate themselves in the political sphere where they can collude with the government in order to get gain, even more power and riches. Having learned the great Mahan secret, that they may murder and get gain, it is precisely this collusion that Occupy in the Book of Mormon argues to undermine our freedom. Rooted in the satanic creed that having staked a claim on all the riches of the earth, it is then only an easy matter to buy up military, political, and church support, and thereby run the whole show. Or as one Occupy member described it, grab all the money and resources, 2, control the political and judicial process, and 3, underfund and discourage universal education to the point that people are ignorant of history and how they are being screwed by their betters. In such a system, the resources of this world are not used to sustain life, but life itself is converted into property. Only in a counterfeit economy such as this world must one sell oneself in order to obtain what God has already freely given. We are told we can have anything in this world, but we must have money, and that will require a conversion of life, either your own or someone else's. And for those of you who refuse to play the game, positions are filled daily in the increasingly privately owned prison industry, where corporations collude with the government to increase incarceration rates while prisoners labor for corporations making body armor, Victoria's Secret, Starbucks, and Microsoft products. The reality is that for many or most of the world's corporations, they are no more than a pile of money to which a number of persons have sold their moral allegiance. The Book of Mormon charts clearly how such groups will obtain the sole management of the government, destroy, quote, the regulations of the government, and thereby trample the poor and meek under their foot, while the guilty and the wicked go unpunished because of their money, so that they might get gain and glory of the world. What a strange world we live in, where in the mockery of the biblical concept of Jubilee, creditors instead of debtors are bailed out, where instead of doing something to protect debtors, the government essentially declares that no debtor should ever be allowed to default, where too big to fail institutions are bailed out by taxpayers, secure in the knowledge they would not be allowed to collapse no matter what their behavior, paying no taxes, but instead delivering vast sums of money from their even vaster profits to legislators who then allow lobbyists to actually write the legislation that is supposed to regulate them. At this point, it's not entirely clear why an institution like Bank of America should not be considered part of the federal government, other than that it gets to keep its profits for itself. A recent example of such life conversion activities are the actions of Goldman Sachs. While many are familiar with their part in the housing market collapse, few are aware of their role in the worldwide food shortage at the end of 2006, when 200 million people, mostly children, couldn't afford food and sank into malnutrition. Despite an increase in wheat production and a slight decrease in demand, food prices skyrocketed. Much like the housing crisis, Goldman Sachs and others, in fine Book of Mormon fashion, lobbied until regulations were destroyed, turned contracts into derivatives, and gave birth to the food speculation market. The world's wealthiest speculators set up a casino where the chips were the stomachs of hundreds of millions of innocent people. They gambled on increasing starvation, and they won. Their wasteland moment created a real wasteland. As Gene Ziegler, the UN Special Rapporteur on Rights to Food, called it, a silent mass murder, entirely due to man-made actions. The most obvious nexus of murder for gain is the military-industrial complex, where those in power take the resources of the state and buy up armies and navies, where they may rule the entire world through blood and horror. Some might consider such a claim to go beyond the evidence. Surely wars are not fought for money. Can war really be a racket, as General Smedley Butler, who called himself a muscle man for big business for Wall Street and the bankers, a racketeer and gangster for capitalism, proclaimed? The oldest, easily the most profitable, surely the most vicious, the only one international in scope, the only one in which profits are reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. One could of course point to the obvious collusion between business, military contractors, and manufacturers, and the government, as Smedley did, but let me suggest that in recent times the connection is even more fundamental. Many don't realize that the modern banking system was created to help fund European wars. The British pound, for example, much like the US dollar, is largely circulating war debt. In 1694, King William received 1.2 million pounds to fight a war in France from London merchants, who in exchange received the right to call themselves the Bank of England, and loaned the king's debt to others in the form of banknotes called pounds, a promise by the government to pay. Likewise, the US dollar represents the circulation of debt, and largely war debt. In his book, Super-Imperialism, the economist Michael Hudson shows how since 1971, when Nixon went off the gold standard, the US has gained the enormous advantage of being able to write checks that are never cashed. Year after year, Treasury bonds are rolled over to buy new ones, while holders take a loss. Interestingly enough, the size of the US deficit corresponds almost exactly to the real SAW military budget. In other words, foreign governments and institutional lenders are buying US Treasury bonds and paying for this enormous military spending. During the Cold War as West Germany, now apart from China, the most important purchasers are places like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Gulf states. What do they have in common? They're covered in US military bases, or under US military protection. The US is borrowing their money to create these bases from the very countries they are sitting upon. In the past, we would call these arrangements empires, and the money sent over was called tribute. Now, apparently, you can't use that language, so we call it a loan. Skip ahead here. One of the more interesting things in the Book of Mormon is in the 6th chapter of Nephi, shortly before the collapse, where we find this odd passage. There began to be some disputings among the people. Some were lifted into pride and boastings because of their great riches, and they began to be distinguished by ranks according to their riches and chances for learning. Some were ignorant because of their poverty, and others did receive great learning because of their riches, and thus there became a great inequality. One of the catalysts for Occupy movements in the United Kingdom, for example, was the attempt to monetize education similar to the American system. Not only did students fear they would soon face a lifetime of crushing debt, but that monetization of learning would change the nature of education from a good in and of itself to a means of obtaining money. Hugh Nibley pointed out long ago the dangers to the university when more lunch or money becomes our lens. While it is true that those in poverty can obtain great learning in America, it is also true that it comes at a high price. A potential lifetime of non-bankruptable debt peonage. High tuition costs and university degree as a prerequisite for employment means that for most, debt is a precondition for your entry into the workforce. In short, you must pay for access to work with your later work. At present, U.S. student loans are nearly $1 trillion, the largest personal consumer debt. It is only a matter of time until this bubble bursts. 1/3 of student loans are now in default, and with little prospects of future employment, many have begun to see that if learning is ultimately a business transaction, then in America, it is a bad one. LSAT entrance exams have dropped, and exiting law student employment is at 45%. And then for those interested in learning for its own sake, Mark Bosquet has shown that university teaching is no longer an option, where in many cases, contingent instructors teach 40 to 50% of all classes. Since 1976, when the student loans have become non-bankable, rates have increased 6.5 times the rate of inflation and 2.5 times the rate of housing market. As if that wasn't bad enough, the parting shot by a leading Republican Congress was to increase interest rates on student loans. And for those of you currently in the university, you can thank your current legislators for now allowing interest to accrue while you are still pursuing your education, beginning later this year. When the Sacramento Bee reported recently how people in their 80s are finding themselves harassed for money they still haven't been able to pay on college loans, is it any surprise that those in Occupy, seeing such a future, have begun burning their payment demands from Sallie Mae? The Book of Mormon at a minimum suggests that when education is treated as a commodity, it leads to class distinctions and inequality. In the U.S., the student loan system has been a major complaint of Occupy, a system where banks and the federal government maintain the student loan program and ensure loans will be held over their heads forever, even in the event of bankruptcy, thus maintaining the banking system control over their future lives. More and more individuals are signing debtors' pledges of refusals, a refusal to stop payments once 1 million have signed, and demanding tuition-free public higher education, zero-interest student loans, private colleges must open their books, and that student debt be written off in the spirit of Jubilee. The refusal to pay has now become a united public display of what was already happening in silence. Let me transition here. All of this that I've described represents the antithesis of the Lord's economy. The Lord tells us that he has stretched out his hands, and that everything here is his, and that it is his purpose to provide for his saints. But it must be needs to be done, quote, in mine own way. And this is the way I have decreed. The poor shall be exalted, and the rich made low. For the earth is full, and there is enough and to spare. The air, the water, the sun, the soil, and all the earth's abundance. Everything we could need is given from the start as a gift, and is meant for all. This is the truth the economist Henry George spoke of in the late 1800s. Who made the earth that any man can claim such ownership, or any part of it, or any right to give, sell, or bequeath it? Since the earth was not made by us, but a temporary dwelling place, on which one generation of men follow another, since we find ourselves here, are manifestly here with equal permission of the Creator, it is manifest that no one can have an exclusive right of ownership in the land. All the rights in the land must be equal and inalienable. There is enough to spare for everyone, but it cannot be done through Satan's counterfeit economy. It is my belief that the alternate story, which Occupy seeks to inhabit, and which the Book of Mormon advocates, rests on two core beliefs. Everything in this world, even our life, is a gift. And that two, we should not deny those gifts to anyone, but share them liberally in common. That the world does not function this way should not surprise us. For once you have accepted the counterfeit story that you can have anything in this world for money, and that you prosper or fail according to your efforts, is only a matter of time until such inequalities arise. The military-industrial complex, the culture's obsession with riches, the great inequality, all stem from the root, a denial of the gifts of God. And what better economic system fits such a worldview than capitalism, that seeks profit everywhere and turns everything from gifts into private property? The air, the water, even our ideas, where one man can claim special financial rewards for being the last link in a complicated social process that produced the invention. And throws typical wit, he mocks the logic of the system, where, quote, if a man walks in the woods for the love of them half of each day, he's in danger of being regarded as a loafer. But if he spends his whole day as a speculator, shearing off those woods and making earth bald before a time, he's esteemed an industrious and enterprising citizen, as if a town had no interest in its forests but to cut them down. In one of the earliest U.S. Supreme Court cases, the court decided Native Americans had no property rights. Why? Because their land was not exclusive. The court explained they did not privatize their land, read held in common, and they did not prevent others from using it, read selfishness. Therefore, they had no property rights. In other words, they didn't believe they had earned their land by taking the gifts of God and borrowing others. By 1880, Congress prepared legislation to break up Indian communal lands and break them into private possessions. Senator Henry Dawes explained it this way: there wasn't a family in that whole nation that had not a home of its own. There was not a pauper, and the nation didn't owe a dollar. It built its own schools, its own hospitals, yet the defect was apparent. They have got as far as they can go because they own their land in common. There's no enterprise to make your home better than that of your neighbors. There's no selfishness, which is at the bottom of civilization. This is a story as old as Adam. We are on this new world, and God has given us a certificate entitling man to food and raiment, but the unrighteous man found a facsimile of the same in God's coffers and appropriated it. And so it is. The gifts of God are taken by some as if they were theirs to own, and denied or granted to others on the basis of money. Thoreau calls it one of the most extensive systems of counterfeiting the world has seen, a system where relations of culture are replaced by intellectual property, relations of obligation and gift replaced by consumer debt, and relations of trust and community replaced by security and surveillance. Inevitably, everything is taken from the commons and wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, while those without must go into lifelong debt they can never pay off just to have access to the necessities. As a result, once everything has become private, those without must accept or die of hunger. In feudal times, slaves, serfs, and tenants gave a lifetime of labor to the Richmond landowners. Today, the proceeds of our labor go to the owners of money, an ingenious substitute for the chain and whip of the slave driver, according to Ambrose Bierce. Meanwhile, those without riches assure us they have earned them by virtue of their cunning, skill, or labor. As Mitt Romney, I'm not worried about the poor, proclaimed to all of America from his holy lectern, or what Zoramites might call a rameumptum. Quote, I didn't inherit my money from my parents. What I have, I earned. I worked the American way. In other words, I deserve the wealth I have because I alone earned it. Those who are poor deserve their poverty because they have failed to earn their wealth. You see, if the American way means anything, it means never acknowledging the hand of another in your success. Invisible hands, perhaps, but never the hand of another living soul, let alone God. As Nibley reminded us, we should be wary of such talk because, quote, no one is more completely of this world than one who lives by this world's economy, whatever his display of open piety. As Samuel laid it out, you have set your hearts upon riches, and you do not remember the Lord your God and the things with which he hath blessed you. You do always remember your riches, but not to thank the Lord your God for them. They simply refused to regard or treat their riches as gifts, but insisted they were earnings. From this point, let me propose some ways forward. We mistakenly believe that property defines our relationship to a thing, but this is not the case. Property in the end is not about our relationship to things, but an arrangement between people concerning things. As the English law puts it, we hold things against all the world. That is, an understanding between ourselves and everyone else on the planet. They will refrain from interfering with our possessions. I believe 4th Nephi describes the antithesis of such a system, where instead of alienation and separation, we have community, and instead of property, we have commons. I often wonder whether we miss some of the more subversive implications of this statement. They had all things in common among them. Therefore, they were not rich nor poor, bond or free, but they were all made free and partakers of the heavenly gift. In a mad rush to become self-reliant, we fail to see that in our very act, we are denying the gifts of God and destroying any possibility for community. Self-reliance and holding all things in common are simply incompatible. In the end, a life that seeks to be independent of other people for the meeting of one's needs is a life without community. Think of the people in 4th Nephi. Were they self-reliant? As a community, perhaps, but individually, surely not. The scriptures state that if you are not one in earthly things, you cannot obtain heavenly things. But we too quickly gloss over the reason. For when we refuse to accept the gifts of God and share them in common, instead create property, we are by that very act alienating and separating our hearts and minds from one another. One need only look at how the dynamics of money and property destroyed family relationships to understand this. Community is nearly impossible in a monetized society like ours. If you are self-reliant, then you don't depend on your neighbors, or indeed on anyone, for anything. The financially independent person is not bereft of community because he meets his needs via money. He is bereft because he is not meeting his needs except through money. Remember, it was Cain who first sought self-reliance, and after killing his brother declared his independence. I am free. I am free. I don't need anyone else. What better description could there be of the loss of community? In gift cultures, people depend on each other for the necessities and pleasures. It is only with enemies and strangers that payment is demanded. We have become a nation of shopkeepers, alienated from each other with no ties that bind us. Let's skip ahead here. This explains one of our fundamental obstacles to community in our current economic system. Community involves social cohesion that is destroyed by the individualistic ethic in our modern capitalistic society. Entity does not come from co-consumption, but co-creation. In a monetized society, we have creativity, but it is always mediated through money. Obligations and gifts bind people together even after they've been paid, but debts bind us only as long as the debt exists. Our relationship dies on a payment. It is precisely when the money changes hands that parties can walk away having nothing to do with each other. Many of us no longer aspire to financial independence, the state in which we have so much money we don't need to depend on anyone. While there may be human and earthly limits, these are, according to Wendell Berry, not confinements, but inducements for elaboration and elegance, the fullness of relationship and meaning. In a proper economy, certain things would be designated as priceless. These would be part of the commons: water, air, soil, internet, knowledge. By starting to create a gift economy, not only would our quality of life remain high, but we would reduce our dependence on the market. Things could be done locally. Let's skip ahead so Damon has more time here. By sharing such things, we would need less money and less time spent earning it. We could find greater cohesion, greater community, and more time to contribute to a gift economy. And why don't we demand a jubilee or forgiving of debts? In the ancient world, it was not repaying debts that was sacred, but one's ability to forgive, or especially cancel debts. And maybe we should learn from that. Not only would a jubilee relieve genuine human suffering, it would be a way of reminding ourselves that money is not ineffable, paying one's debts is not the essence of morality, and that all these things are human arrangements, and that if democracy is to mean anything, it's the ability to agree to arrange things in a different way. Many of these ideas are, of course, deeply rooted in the teachings of King Benjamin, where dependence, not self-reliance, is what is important. The natural man is not a metaphysical state of an individual, but instead has a social character. It is a state of rejecting communion with God and neighbor, of rejecting our radical dependence on our community and God. Benjamin reminds us everything is a gift of God, and even more radical, that any claim God may have on us he transfers to our neighbor. We may ultimately realize that God gives us gifts to see what we'll do with them. As our example in all things, he has given us this world, life, and the privilege of practicing gift giving. And for those who practice such an art, we are told the gifts will never run out, for all he has is ours. It is no coincidence that at the epicenter of Occupy are gifts, an impromptu library, a kitchen. These are just a few of the gift-giving acts through which Occupy seeks to decommodify the common goods to through co-governance and shatter the assumptions that underlie state capitalism. If you want to create a world of abundance, a world of gift, you can start today by sharing whatever you have to create more gratitude in the world. This may go against the rational self-interest, but that is a very short-sighted self-interest. Because while money may become slippery, the ties of community that bind us will persist through any calamity. We have seen firsthand how treasures can disappear when our hearts are set upon them, as Sam reminded us. But by setting our hearts on relationships and community over money, we invest in an economy of gifts that has no end. That is the kind of wealth that fires cannot burn and thieves cannot steal. What has impressed me most about Occupy are the accounts of many who say this is not about politics, this is spiritual. Similar to the civil rights movement, there are a growing number who say they're inspired to be there. They are, quote, living up to the call. I often wonder if we are having our Samuel the Occupier moment, and like the Nephites, fail to notice the warning. Much of what I'm arguing for makes no sense. It is the stuff of dreams. Jesus says you can't serve God and wealth. Don't worry about your life, what to eat, what to drink. Don't worry about your body, what to bear. There's more to life than food. There's more to the body than a suit of clothes. Why worry about what to wear? Take a tip from the lilies. They don't work, they don't weave. But let me tell you this. Even Solomon, all his finery, was not dressed as well as one of these. So if God gives that clothing to the grass of the field, isn't he far more likely to clothe you too, you little faith? So don't worry with what you'll eat or what you'll drink or what you'll wear. These are Gentile concerns. Your Heavenly Father knows them all. Instead, make your top priority God's kingdom, his way of life, and these things will be given to you. The Book of Mormon speaks of our day when miracles will cease. I wonder if what keeps us from believing there is no other way is the fear that there are no more miracles. As the Book of Mormon states, woe unto him that shall say at that day, to get gain, there be no more miracles. Ultimately, it seems that we can participate in one of two stories. We can deny the gifts of God, rely on the management of our own creature, which includes accepting all of the evils of a market economy, or we can recognize that everything is a gift of God, that we should not deny those gifts to anyone, but share them liberally and in common. And yes, that may even require believing in miracles.